I want to be very clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not the kind of person who imagines things. I have never believed in ghosts. I have never had a nightmare I couldn't shake. I am a 34-year-old structural engineer. I think in load-bearing calculations and tensile tolerances. What I am about to tell you happened exactly as I say it happened, and the reason I'm still awake 3 months later, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., is not because I don't know what I saw. It's because I do. It was the last weekend of September. You know how the air changes at the end of September? How it develops a kind of edge, not cold exactly, but aware of cold. The way a room feels different when someone has just left it. That's how the air felt the whole drive up to the ridge. There were 3 of us, me, my colleague Dara, and her boyfriend Marcus. We'd been planning the camping trip since July, originally as a larger group, but people dropped out one by one the way people always do, until it was just the 3 of us and 2 tents and a cooler that Marcus had packed with too much beer and not enough actual food. I remember thinking that was funny. I remember being in a good mood. I need you to hold on to that. The version of me that was in a good mood, because I am going to lose him somewhere out there on the ridge, and I am not entirely sure I have gotten him back. We drove 4 hours northeast. The last 40 minutes was a gravel road that my GPS eventually gave up on, throwing up its hands and replacing the map with a blank gray screen and a pulsing blue dot that seemed less confident with every mile. Marcus drove. Dara sat in the passenger seat scrolling through a playlist she never quite settled on, flicking from song to song every 30 seconds, and I sat in the back watching the trees change. That's the thing about a drive into deep forest. The trees change. First, they're sparse and sunlit, almost friendly, the kind of trees you'd see in a park. Then they crowd closer. Then they stop looking like individual trees and start looking like a single, continuous wall, and the spaces between them become suggestions rather than gaps. And the light starts to do something different. It doesn't disappear. It fragments. It arrives at ground level in broken pieces, like something is filtering it, like something is choosing what gets through. Nobody else seemed to notice that. I watched it happen through the car window, and I felt something I can only describe as recognition. Not of a place I'd been, but of a feeling I'd had before, a long time ago, when I was very young. The feeling of being watched by something that is not hostile, not friendly, but simply terribly attentive. I said nothing. I put on my headphones and listened to a podcast about Roman aqueducts, which is the kind of thing I listen to. And I told myself I was tired from the week, and that tiredness makes everything seem heavier than it is. I told myself a lot of things on that drive. I ran out of things to tell myself around mile 37 of that gravel road, when I saw the deer. It was standing at the tree line, motionless, not the paralytic stillness of an animal caught by headlights. We were driving in early afternoon, full sun. This was a deliberate stillness, a chosen stillness. It was a doe, medium-sized, and it was facing us directly. And I want to be precise here. Its head was level. Its ears were not raised. Its tail was not flagging. Every signal that a deer uses to communicate alarm was absent. It was simply standing there, watching the car pass, with an expression. And I know how that sounds. I know animals don't have expressions. But there was something in the arrangement of its features that I can only call resigned. The way a person looks when they've already told you not to do something and you're doing it anyway. The car passed. In my peripheral vision, I watched the deer turn, slowly, tracking us. I took out my headphones. I did not put them back in for the rest of the drive. We set up camp in a clearing about half a mile from where the trail ended. It was a good clearing, wide enough to get genuine sky overhead, with a fire ring that previous campers had built from stones. The stones were old and darkened in a way that suggested they had held fire many, many times. I remember thinking that was comforting. People had been here before. People had been here before and had been fine. The first night was genuinely good. We built a fire. Marcus made a reasonable chili with what we had. Dara had brought marshmallows and we burned them in the way you are supposed to burn them, to a specific level of char that produces a caramel interior. We talked about things people talk about around fires: work, old memories, hypothetical futures. It was warm. It was, for a few hours, exactly what I'd wanted it to be. I went to sleep around midnight. My tent was the smaller one, positioned about 20 feet from Dara and Marcus's, on the far side of the fire ring. I remember zipping the door closed and feeling the specific satisfaction of being inside a tent, that sense of having drawn a boundary between yourself and the larger dark. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up at 2:47 a.m. I know the time because I checked my phone immediately, which is a habit I have even when waking in the night. 2:47 a.m. The phone screen was the only light. I lay still, trying to understand what had woken me. The forest was quiet. That is the detail I need you to understand. It was quiet in a way that forests are not supposed to be quiet at night. There are always sounds, insects, wind through branches, the small, frantic movements of nocturnal animals. All of that was absent. The silence was not peaceful. It was pressurized. It was the silence of held breath. And then, very slowly, I became aware that there was something standing outside my tent. I cannot explain how I knew. I heard nothing. There was no shadow. The night was overcast, no moonlight to cast one. But the air near the tent wall changed pressure in a specific way, the way the air in a room changes when you are not alone in it, and the hairs on my forearms rose one by one like something was calibrating them, and I stopped breathing. 3 seconds. 5. 10. Nothing moved. Whatever was there, if anything was there, was as still as the deer on the road, the same quality of stillness, chosen, deliberate. I reached for my flashlight. My hand found it on the first try, which I remember noticing because my hands don't usually work that well when I'm frightened. I pointed it at the tent wall and turned it on. Shadow. The shadow of a standing figure cast against the nylon from outside. It was humanoid, upright, proportioned like a person, and it was close, much closer to the tent than the flashlight's beam should have been able to project a shadow that large. Which means it was large, or it was very close to the fabric. I did not move for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 12 seconds. Then the shadow turned and walked away. I heard its footsteps then, just then, only then, a sound like something heavy moving through leaves in a way that was almost careful. Almost. I sat in that tent until the sky turned gray. I did not go back to sleep. When Dara and Marcus emerged in the morning, I told them what I had seen, and Marcus made a joke about bears standing upright, which is something bears do, and I laughed because I wanted it to be that, because I needed it to be that. It was not shaped like a bear. The second day, we hiked. The trail from our camp to the ridge took about 90 minutes at a comfortable pace, switchbacking up through a section of the forest where the trees were older, visibly, noticeably older, with bark that had corrugated itself into something almost geological. Lichens growing in colors I didn't have names for. I kept falling behind the others, not because I was slower, but because something kept making me stop. Sound, or the absence of it. 3 separate times on that trail, in 3 separate locations, the forest went quiet, the way it had gone quiet the night before. Not gradually, suddenly, like a switch. Full ambience one moment, pressurized silence the next. Each time it lasted 15 or 20 seconds, and then the birds came back, and the insects resumed, and everything normalized, and Dara would look back at me, and I'd make a face that meant I'm fine, just catching my breath. I was not catching my breath. The ridge itself was beautiful. I want to say that clearly. There was a view across a valley that I will remember for the rest of my life. A sweep of forested hillside in early autumn color, gold and rust, and the deep, reluctant green of trees that haven't yet accepted the season. We took photographs. Marcus put his arm around Dara. I stood at the edge and looked out and thought, for a moment, that everything was going to be fine. That's when I noticed the other trail. It branched off from the main path about 40 feet back, a narrower track, less maintained, threading down the back side of the ridge into a section of forest that the light didn't reach from where I was standing. There was no marker, no sign indicating where it went. There was, however, near the entrance to the path, a tree that had been marked with something. Not carved, not blazed, marked. A series of horizontal lines, deep and deliberate, at roughly chest height. Below the lines, something that might have been a word in a language or notation I didn't recognize. I photographed it. I have zoomed in on that photograph many times since. Each time, what I thought was writing looks slightly different. Sometimes like Cyrillic, sometimes like a series of numbers. Once, at 4 a.m. on a sleepless night, it looked like nothing, like lines, like something had just walked past a soft tree with its fingers extended. Marcus came up beside me. "Don't," he said. I hadn't said anything, hadn't moved toward the path. He just said, "Don't," looking at the same thing I was looking at. I asked him what he meant. He said he didn't know. He said, "Let's go back down." And we did. We did not talk much on the way back. Dara fell twice on the trail, once badly enough to put a gash in her palm, and the blood seemed very bright against the forest floor. We packed up camp that evening, hours earlier than planned, and none of us directly addressed why. Marcus drove us back in near silence, and the blue dot on the GPS reasserted itself as we came back into range, and I watched the trees thin out, and when we finally hit the main road, I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 2 hours. We got home. We shook hands in the parking lot and said we'd do it again sometime, which we all knew we would not. I never posted the photographs. Not the ridge view, not the autumn hillside, and not the tree with the markings. But I kept them. I look at them sometimes, late at night, and I try to approach them the way I approach structural problems. Methodically, without assumption, starting from what I can verify. What I can verify. There was a figure outside my tent. It was large and upright, and it walked away. What I can verify. 3 times on that trail, every living sound stopped at once. What I can verify. There is a path branching off the back of that ridge that leads somewhere none of us went, and a tree at its entrance that someone or something has marked with intention. what I cannot verify, whether any of it means anything, whether it was all explicable and I simply lacked the explanation, whether the human brain, removed from the regulation of city noise and artificial light and the soft, constant reassurance of other humans nearby, manufactures threat from neutral data, dresses random pattern in the clothing of meaning. I think about that possibility a lot. I find it almost comforting. What I think about less, because I don't know what to do with it, is something Dara told me a week after we got back. She'd been quiet since the trip, and I'd chalked it up to the same general unease we'd all brought home. Then she texted me late on a Tuesday night. Just one message. She said, when she fell on the trail the second time, when she put her hand down to catch herself and her palm came up bleeding, she said she looked back, instinctively, in the direction we'd come from. She said there was something at the top of the last switchback, at the edge of where the trail curved out of sight. Standing, watching. She said she told herself it was a hiker. She said she hadn't told me on the trail because she didn't want to scare me. She said she thinks about the markings on the tree. She says they've been changing in her memory, that every time she tries to picture them, they look slightly different. I know what she means. Her last message was this: what if it wasn't watching us because we were there? What if it was watching us because we were about to go down that other path and we didn't? I haven't replied yet. I'm not sure what to say. I'm not sure whether that thought is terrifying because she's wrong or because she isn't. My daughter asked me last week why I flinch when she leaves a light on in another room. She's 7, so she asked it the way 7-year-olds ask things. Not unkindly, just directly, the way children are direct before the world teaches them that some questions are dangerous. I told her it was a habit. I told her it was nothing. What I did not tell her is that there is a specific quality of light. Light in a room you didn't know anyone was in. Light in a tent when you thought you were alone in the woods. Light appearing in complete darkness without source or explanation. That I will never be able to see again without my body making a decision before my brain catches up. She deserves a better answer than that. I'm not capable of giving her one. 11 years ago, before my daughter, before my marriage, before I became the version of myself who flinches at ambient light, I was 23 years old and I went into the Allegheny National Forest alone. 4 nights, solo. People told me not to. Not because of anything in particular, not because of any recent incident or local legend, just the general ambient concern that people express when a young woman says she's going somewhere alone. I dismissed it the way I dismissed most things at 23, with a confidence I had not yet earned the right to have. I want to tell you that I was experienced. I was, technically. I'd done backcountry camping a dozen times with various combinations of friends and family, and I'd read everything I was supposed to read, and I had a good pack and a reliable water filter and a first aid kit that I actually knew how to use. I wasn't reckless. I want to say that clearly. What happened to me out there did not happen because I was careless. The first 2 days were everything I wanted them to be. I've never been good at being still. My mind runs constantly, a scroll of unfinished tasks and half-formed anxieties. But something about moving through forest with a heavy pack imposes a particular quality of presence. Your attention narrows to the next 10 feet of trail. Your body's demands, water, food, the management of terrain, become priority. Everything else recedes. I had gone to the woods precisely because I needed everything else to recede. I set up camp each night in designated sites, but on the 3rd day, I pushed further than planned. I'd found a tributary creek that wasn't on my map. which is the kind of thing that can happen out there, the wilderness being less accurately mapped than we like to assume. And by the time I accepted that I should stop and camp, I was not where I'd intended to be. I found a flat area near the creek. I set up my tent. I boiled water and made the freeze-dried meal I always chose last because it was the least bad and therefore the most worth saving. And I ate it, watching the last light leave the sky. There was another tent in the clearing. I don't know when I noticed it. That's the first thing that disturbs me about this story, not the tent itself, but the fact that I can't identify the moment I became aware of it. It was as if my brain had been carefully not looking at it and then suddenly ran out of capacity to keep not looking. One moment I was watching the sky darken. The next moment I was aware that 50 feet away, half concealed behind a stand of hemlocks, there was a tent. Orange, freestanding, older looking, its fabric matte in a way that newer tents aren't. My first thought was, someone else is here, which should have been a neutral thought. The forest is a shared resource. Backcountry campers encounter each other. But something about the tent produced a reaction in me that preceded thought. A visceral contraction, like when you reach into a bag in the dark and your fingers find something unexpected. The tent was dark inside, no light, no movement. I told myself the occupant was asleep. It was after 7. Some hikers sleep early. I was very deliberate about telling myself this, which is itself a tell. When you have to work to convince yourself of the mundane explanation, part of you has already rejected it. I got into my tent. I laid my bear spray within reach and my knife within reach, and I told myself I was being paranoid, and I tried to sleep. At some point deep in the night, I woke up because there was a light in the other tent. I lay absolutely still. My tent door faced the creek. The other tent was behind me, which meant I couldn't see it directly without turning over and unzipping my fly, and I did not want to do either of those things. I could see the light, though. It came through the back wall of my tent, muted by 2 layers of nylon, but unmistakable. A soft, steady glow. Someone was awake over there. Someone had a lantern, or a phone, or a flashlight propped upright. All of those were normal explanations. I lay still and cataloged the sounds. Creek, wind, nothing else. No voices, no movement sounds from the other tent, no rustling of sleeping bag or shifting of equipment. Just the light, steady, unbroken, the light of something that was not moving. I checked my phone. 3:19 a.m. I considered my options with the careful rationality of someone trying very hard to stay calm. Option 1, go back to sleep, assume normal, deal with morning. Option 2, call out, identify myself, make social contact. Option 3, pack up and leave in the dark, which would be dangerous on terrain I didn't fully know. I chose option 1. I closed my eyes. I listened to the creek. The light persisted behind my eyelids, a reddish warmth through the tent wall, and I thought about the drive up, about the creek that wasn't on my map, about the fact that this clearing was not a designated site and was therefore a place that, technically, no one was supposed to be camping, including me. I fell asleep eventually. When I woke at dawn, the other tent was dark. I got up, made coffee on my small stove, ate a granola bar, watched the other tent. Nothing moved. At 6:30 a.m., I walked over. There was no one there. The tent was empty, not recently vacated, but empty in the sense of having never been occupied. No sleeping pad, No sleeping bag. No pack, no food, no equipment. Nothing personal. Just the tent, orange and slightly weathered, staked into the ground with care, the door zipped shut from the outside. I stood there for a long time. No footprints around it that I could identify as distinct from the general disturbance of the soil. The stakes were driven deep in the way you'd do it if you were planning to stay for a while, or if you'd been here a long time. The fabric was dry, even though there had been a heavy dew. It was under the hemlocks, in deep shadow, but still. A tent exposed to that degree of night moisture should have had condensation on it. I put my hand on the fabric. It was warm. Not warmth from sun. There was no sun on it. Not warmth from recent occupation. A specific interior warmth, like something had just been inside it. I pulled my hand back. I walked to my campsite. I broke down my tent in 14 minutes, which is a personal record I have never beaten. I left without eating breakfast. I was back at the trailhead by 9 a.m., which meant I'd covered 6 miles in under 2.5 hours, including a section of trail I'd found difficult on the way in. I didn't stop moving until I was in my car with the doors locked. I told myself various things on the drive home. Squatter. Eccentric day hiker who staked an empty tent and hiked out. Some kind of trail marker system I wasn't familiar with. My own disorientation, still half asleep in the dark, imagining light that wasn't there. Each explanation had the right shape but the wrong weight. They were balloons when I needed stone. 3 weeks later, I made a mistake. I started searching. Not for the tent specifically. There's no way to search for a tent. I searched for the area, the tributary creek, incidents, history, the particular corner of the Allegheny that I'd been in. I want to be careful about how I tell this part. I found a news item from 1987. A hiker reported missing, presumed lost, in approximately the area where I'd camped. No body was ever recovered. The article was brief and undetailed in the way local news from 1987 is brief and undetailed. I found a forum post from 2009, a hiker describing a camp in that general region in which he claimed to have seen, over the course of 2 nights, what he called anomalous light sources in the trees above his camp. He was clearly an outdoorsman, not a dramatic person. His post was skeptical of itself, full of qualifications. He'd chalked it up to bioluminescence, he said, though he'd never seen bioluminescence present itself that way, that high. These are 2 data points. 2 data points are not a pattern. I am an empirical person, and I know that 2 data points are not a pattern. But then there was the photograph. I found it on a hiking blog, a woman's detailed account of a solo trip in the same area, summer of 2014. She'd photographed her campsite, clear morning light, good composition, and in the background, half concealed by hemlocks, orange fabric, a tent. Her post mentioned nothing about it, no text referencing another camper, another tent. She'd apparently not noticed it, or if she noticed it, had chosen not to address it. The comment section had 12 responses, all about her photography, her trail notes, her gear. Nobody mentioned the tent. I left a comment. I wrote, "Did you have a campmate? There's a second tent in your photo." She never replied. She posted once more after that, 3 weeks later, a short trail review with no photographs. Then, nothing. The blog has not been updated since 2014. I don't know what that means. I've told myself many times that it means nothing, that she just stopped blogging, that the tent in her photo was her own tent and I was looking at the image wrong, that the warm fabric was a trick of my own skin temperature and my own fear. What I cannot explain away, What I return to in the dark, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, is this. When I drove away from that clearing at 9 in the morning, I looked in my rearview mirror. Force of habit. I don't know why. The clearing was behind me. The other tent was still there. And the door, which I was certain had been zipped shut when I walked away, which I had checked, standing 3 feet from it before I left, the door was open. Not fully open, partially. A gap in the zipper at eye level, precisely the width of a face looking out. I didn't stop the car. I want to be honest about that. Every part of me that was functional was pointed at the road ahead, at the trailhead, at my locked car, at the drive home. I did not stop. I did not go back. I am glad I did not go back. I think I am glad I did not go back. My daughter is 7. She has a yellow tent that we set up in the living room sometimes on rainy weekends, and she fills it with stuffed animals and sits inside with a flashlight and a book, and the specific contentment of children who have found a contained space and claimed it. I watch her from the couch. I watch the light move behind the yellow fabric. I watch her small shadow shift and settle. And I feel something I have no name for. Not quite fear, not quite love, but something between them, something that lives in the same register as both. The awareness that there are things in the world you cannot classify, cannot explain, cannot file into the appropriate folder and close the drawer. She asked me last week why I flinch at light in a room I didn't know was occupied. The real answer is because once, in a forest in Pennsylvania, I put my hand on an empty tent that had been full of light all night, and the fabric was warm. The real answer is because I looked in my rearview mirror and the door had moved. The real answer is because I don't know what was inside it, and I am no longer entirely sure that what matters is what was inside it. What matters might be that it knew I was there, and it waited. I've been asked to describe the man we met in the woods many times. By my husband, by the police, eventually, by the one therapist I saw who I decided fairly quickly I wasn't going to go back to because she kept using the word perception in a way I found dishonest. I've described him many times, and the description is always the same. He was ordinary. He was, by every observable measure, a completely ordinary person who did a completely ordinary thing, who helped 2 people who were lost and asked for nothing in return, and sent us back to our car and disappeared into the trees. That is the full extent of what occurred. What I cannot explain, what I am still, 4 years later, unable to satisfactorily explain, is why, for 4 years, I have not slept a full night without waking from a dream of his face. My husband Joel and I got lost on a Sunday afternoon in October. We were hiking a trail in the Catskills that we'd done before, or thought we'd done before. It turned out we'd done a different trail in the same park, a distinction that became critical when the trail we thought we knew diverged in a way we didn't expect, and we made the wrong choice at the fork and walked for 90 minutes before admitting, in the way that couples admit difficult things, through incremental and increasingly strained negotiation, that neither of us knew where we were. It was not yet dangerous. I want to be clear about the actual facts of the situation. We were in a state park in the Catskills, not deep wilderness. We had water and snacks and both of our phones, though the signal was unreliable. We had maybe 2 hours of daylight. The temperature was dropping, but not precipitously. The rational response was to stay on the trail, stay calm, and wait for someone to pass or for one of us to get a signal and call for help. We did stay calm. We were, I think, genuinely calm. The functional kind of calm that kicks in when you realize anxiety is not going to help. Joel sat on a log, and I walked back and forth trying to get my phone signal to behave. At one point, he made a joke. I don't remember what it was. I remember laughing, which is a thing I no longer take for granted. We'd been stopped for about 20 minutes when we heard someone on the trail behind us. Footsteps. Purposeful. Coming from the direction we'd come from, which meant coming from further into the forest rather than toward the trailhead, which was odd, but not remarkable. There are many ways to move through a trail system, and hikers often come from unexpected directions. He came around the bend in the trail, and we both saw him at the same moment. 50, maybe 55. Medium height, medium build. He was wearing hiking clothes, good ones, expensive looking, broken in rather than new. A wool cap, dark green. A pack that was neither very large nor very small. He had a beard, neat, gray at the edges. He was walking with the comfortable gait of someone who had been in woods for a long time and was not tired by them. He saw us and raised a hand in greeting. I felt, immediately, a profound and total relief. The kind of relief that moves through your whole body when a problem you've been quietly terrified about resolves itself. I remember looking at Joel, and he was smiling, his shoulders dropping, and I knew he felt it too. The man asked if we were lost. His voice was mild, warm, unremarkable. I said yes, we'd taken the wrong fork. He nodded as though this was something he'd encountered before, which I assumed it was. He knew exactly where we were. He described our position relative to the trailhead with precise and easy confidence, named the trail, the fork, the distance we'd gone wrong. He said he'd walk us back to the turnoff. He said it wasn't out of his way. We thanked him. We walked. 20 minutes, maybe 25. He led, we followed, and we talked in the way you talk with strangers on trails. Surface conversation, comfortable, no demand. He asked where we'd driven from. He mentioned the weather, the early leaf turn, a bird he'd spotted near the creek that morning. He was easy to be around. I remember noting, consciously, how easy he was to be around. And yet, here's where I need you to understand that the thing I'm about to describe is not something I noticed in the moment. It's something I reconstructed afterward, carefully, methodically, during the many nights I've spent going over every detail. In the moment, I felt entirely at ease. Whatever part of me that should have been paying attention was not paying attention, and I don't know why. In 20 minutes of walking and talking, he did not tell us his name. We offered ours. I said mine, Joel said his. The man acknowledged both, used our names once each in the conversation, naturally, without making a point of it. And he never said his own. At no point did he introduce himself. At no point did we ask. I have thought about this many times. This is not normal. When you meet someone in the woods who helps you, you exchange names. It's a social ritual so deeply ingrained that its absence should register. It did not register. Not until I was in the car, an hour later, going over the conversation, and realized I had no name to attach to the face. He did not talk about where he was going or where he had come from. He talked about birds, about the leaf turn, about how the trail drainage was better on this section than it had been, which implied familiarity with the trail over multiple seasons, about a recommended diner 40 minutes south on Route 28. All present tense information. All, I realized later, information that told me nothing. At some point, walking, I fell behind slightly, my shoelace undone. I stopped and tied it and looked up, and the man and Joel had moved around a curve in the trail, out of sight, and there was a moment, 8 seconds, 10, when I was alone. The forest went quiet. The exact way I have now heard described by others, sudden, total, a pressure. 8 seconds of absolute silence, And in that silence, without any triggering logic, a thought arrived in my head fully formed, the way thoughts don't usually arrive. The thought was, you do not know what this is. Not who, what. And then Joel called my name from around the bend, and the birds came back, and I stood up and walked forward, and the thought, the feeling, it was gone, washed out. And when I came around the curve and saw them both standing there, the man looking back at me with that mild, warm expression, it seemed absurd. It seemed like exhaustion and low blood sugar and the mild stress of being lost for a while. I smiled at him. He smiled back. We reached the fork 18 minutes later. He pointed us in the right direction. We thanked him again, genuinely, the way you thank someone who has helped you. He said something modest about it being no trouble. He said to enjoy the drive home. He turned back the way we'd come. Joel and I walked to the trailhead. We got in the car. Joel said the man seemed nice. I said yes. I said the diner sounded good. Joel found it on his phone, and we drove there, and it was a fine diner, perfectly ordinary. And I ate a tuna melt, and I thought about nothing. Not until the drive home. Not until I tried to tell Joel the man's name and found I had nothing. I am going to describe 3 things that individually mean nothing. First thing. 2 weeks after the hike, I was going through the photographs I'd taken that day. Trail photos, leaf photos, the view from the high point of the trail before we got lost. I was not specifically looking for anything. I was making a folder. I have always been diligent about photo organization. I reached the photos from after we'd gotten lost. I had taken 2 photos on the walk back with the man, one of a particular stand of birch that caught my eye, one of a view through the trees. The birch photo had the man at its left edge, his arm, his shoulder, a piece of his green cap. I stared at that photograph for a long time before I could identify what was wrong with it. He had no pack. I was certain he had been wearing a pack. I had noted it specifically. Good pack, neither too large nor too small. The kind you notice because it looks like it belongs on the person. In the photograph, his shoulder was bare. I compared it to my memory with the careful attention I would give to a discrepancy in a project file. My memory was clear. Pack, present. Photograph, pack, absent. One of them was wrong. Photographs don't lie in this particular way, which meant my memory was wrong, which meant I was less certain than I thought about what I had and hadn't seen. Second thing. Joel, 3 months after the hike, during dinner, on a night when neither of us had mentioned the man in at least a month, set down his fork and said, "He didn't have a shadow." I looked at him. He said, "The guy in the woods. I keep thinking about it. The light was coming from the side, that late afternoon angle. You and I both had shadows, and I can't put a shadow on him in my memory. Every time I try to picture it, there's no shadow. I know that's not possible. I know that. I just can't." He stopped. He picked up his fork. He said, "Never mind." I did not say, "Never mind." I said, "What do you think it means?" Joel is a sensible person. He is more sensible than I am in most practical matters, and I have always trusted his assessment of things. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think it means I was in a heightened emotional state, and my memory is filling in gaps in ways that aren't accurate. I think if I'd been paying better attention, I'd remember his shadow." He paused. "I think that's what I think." I asked what he thought the other option was. He said, "I don't know. I don't have a framework for the other option." Third thing, and this is the one I've never told anyone, including Joel, including the therapist. This is the one that stays with me in the dark. 6 months after the hike, I drove back to the Catskills alone. I told Joel I was visiting a friend who lives in Kingston. I drove to the park. I walked the trail, the right one this time, to the fork where the man had pointed us home. I sat at the fork for a while. I watched the trail in both directions. I told myself I didn't know what I was looking for. I told myself I was closing a loop, processing something, doing what humans do when they need to mark an experience as finished. I was there for about 40 minutes when I realized someone was watching me. Not from the trail, from the trees, off trail in the forest proper, in the low afternoon light. A stillness that my eye caught and my brain took a moment to process. A figure, standing, too far in the shade to see clearly. I stood up. I looked directly at it. It was looking back at me. Of that I am certain. Whatever it was oriented toward me. It knew I was there. And then it took one step backward into deeper shadow and was gone. I stood at that fork for another minute, completely unable to move. Then I walked back to my car. Fast, not running. I told myself I was not running. I drove south on Route 28. I passed the diner he'd recommended. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there with the engine on. The diner had closed. Not recently. A printed sign in the window said it had closed in 2019, 2 years before our hike. The windows were dark. There were weeds in the planters. He had recommended a diner that was not open, that had not been open for 2 years. And the thing is, I looked it up later, on my phone in that parking lot, hands unsteady, radio still on, some afternoon program about home renovation playing quietly in the background. The diner had closed in March of 2019, before the pandemic, before anything else I could point to as a reason for false information. He had told us to enjoy a meal at a place that was not there, which means he either didn't know, which is possible, or he had known us before we met him. He had known we would pass that diner on our route home, and he had wanted us to stop there at something closed and dark and empty. I don't know what we would have found if we'd stopped. I don't know what found us instead in those trees 6 months later. I don't know if the man at the fork knew us the way you know a stranger, by inference, by observation, or if he knew us the way you know someone you've been waiting for. Joel and I don't hike anymore. He frames it differently than I do. He says we've just gotten busy, that there's always something on the weekend, that we'll get back to it. I let him frame it that way. I don't have a better framework. I think about the man in the woods with a regularity I have never admitted out loud. Not obsessively. I don't want you to picture someone unraveling. I am functional. I go to work. I cook dinner. I laugh at things. But the way a scar becomes part of the surface of your skin, becomes just a feature of your body that you carry, this has become a feature of my mind that I carry. The ordinary man who knew where we were, who had no name, who walked us out of the woods and turned back into them, who recommended a place that wasn't there, who was standing 6 months later in the trees at the exact fork where he'd sent us home. Sometimes I wonder whether he helped us, genuinely, whether what I felt on that walk, that total ease, that absence of alarm, was the truth of the encounter, and everything I've constructed since is the noise my brain makes when it can't categorize a thing. Humans fear what they can't classify. The uncanny valley isn't a place, it's a cognitive error. Maybe I met a man who was simply unusual, and my pattern-seeking mind built a door where there was only a wall. That's what I tell myself on good days. On other days, I think about the step backward, the figure in the trees, taking one step backward into darkness, watching me watch it. The specific deliberateness of that movement. Not fleeing, not approaching. One step backward. The way you'd step back if you'd been seen before you were ready. The way you'd step back to wait. On those days, I sit very still, and I feel it. The thing that has no name. The sense from the middle of that trail when I was briefly alone and a thought arrived that I didn't choose. The sense that whatever we encountered, we did not encounter on its terms. We encountered it on ours. And it led us.